As the reclusive novelist Adrien Duval arrives at Chateau de Lune, a crumbling estate shrouded in mist and legend, he seeks solace to complete his magnum opus. Instead, he encounters Elise, the chateau's enigmatic caretaker, whose presence is as captivating as it is unsettling. Her emerald eyes seem to pierce through his soul, and her velvety voice lingers in the air like a forbidden melody. Each night, Adrien is drawn deeper into Elise's seductive allure, her touch awakening cravings he never knew he harbored. Yet, as their passion ignites, the chateau's eerie history begins to surface. Whispers echo through the hallways, portraits seem to watch him, and the once idyllic retreat morphs into a labyrinth of carnal obsession and shadowy secrets. Elise's curse binds her to the chateau, feeding on the desires of those who cross its threshold. The more Adrien succumbs to her temptations, the closer he edges toward a fate sealed in pleasure and torment. To break her chains, Adrien must confront the chateau's darkest truths and choose between love's liberation or an eternity enslaved by desire. The first night at the chateau was serene, the kind of quiet that Adrien Duval had been craving. Yet, even as he sat by the flickering hearth, scribbling notes for his novel, a faint melody wafted through the air. The sound of a piano, haunting and mournful, seemed to draw him out of his thoughts. He followed the melody down the corridor. Its stone walls lined with faded portraits of long-dead nobles. At the end of the hall, he found Elise, seated at an antique piano in the moonlit parlor. Her slender fingers danced across the keys, her face a mask of focused longing. "You play beautifully," Adrien said, his voice breaking the spell. Elise turned slowly, her lips curving into a smile that sent shivers down his spine. "Music has a way of unveiling what words cannot," she replied, her voice low and hypnotic. Adrien found himself unable to look away as she stood and approached him, her silk gown clinging to her curves in a way that made his breath hitch. She moved with an almost predatory grace, closing the distance between them. "You must find this place isolating," Adrien said, his voice faltering as she stood close, her scent a mix of lavender and something darker, more intoxicating. "Not when I have company," Elise murmured, her fingers lightly brushing the sleeve of his shirt. The touch was electric, igniting a heat that spread through his body. Before he could respond, Elise leaned in, her lips hovering near his ear. "Do you often lose yourself in your work, Adrien? Or are there other ways you like to be consumed?" The question was a spark to dry tinder. Adrien's restraint unraveled as he turned to her, his hand brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. Her eyes locked onto his, and in them, he saw a flicker of something primal, something dangerous. Their lips met, a slow and deliberate kiss that deepened into a storm of passion. Elise's hands roamed his chest, slipping beneath his shirt as she guided him backward. The cold stone wall pressed against his back, a stark contrast to the fire blazing between them. But just as his hands gripped her waist, a chill swept through the room, and the flickering candlelight dimmed. Elise froze, her breath hitching as her gaze darted to the shadows. "You shouldn't trust everything that feels good," she whispered, stepping back abruptly, her expression unreadable. "Elise, what is it?" Adrien asked, his voice heavy with confusion and lingering desire. "Nothing," she said, though her tone betrayed her. "Good night, Adrien," and just like that, she was gone, leaving Adrien alone with the echoes of her touch and the lingering sensation that he had stepped into something far more perilous than he. Following nights unraveled him further. Elise would appear and disappear like a ghost, her presence both intoxicating and unnerving. Their encounters grew bolder, stolen kisses in the library, whispered confessions by the fire, the feel of her nails grazing his skin as she pulled him closer. Yet, with each moment of passion, Adrien felt the weight of something unspoken. Elise's eyes, for all their allure, held a sorrow he couldn't ignore. The shadows seemed to come alive around them, the walls creaked with whispers, and the air grew heavy with an unseen presence. One night, as they lay entwined in her room, the moonlight casting ethereal patterns on their skin, Adrien couldn't hold back his questions any longer. "What are you hiding from me, Elise?" he asked, his fingers tracing the curve of her shoulder. She turned to him, her expression a mix of vulnerability and defiance. "I warned you not to trust everything that feels good," she said. "This chateau, it binds me. And now, it's beginning to bind you." Adrien frowned, but before he could press further, Elise straddled him, silencing his questions with a kiss that stole his breath. Her movements were deliberate, her body a weapon of seduction that left him powerless. But even as their bodies moved together, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing more than just himself in her embrace. The chateau's secrets were closing in, and Adrien realized too late that passion might not be the only force tying him to Elise, it could also be the thing that destroyed him. Their passion igniting like wildfire whenever they crossed paths. Adrien couldn't resist Elise's pull, and she made no effort to hide her desire for him. Each kiss, each touch, seemed to strip away another layer of his resolve, leaving him bare and exposed to her whims, yet, beneath the pleasure, there was a shadow. Elise led Adrien to the grand ballroom, its vast emptiness illuminated only by a cascade of moonlight streaming through the tall, arched windows. Her gown shimmered, hugging her curves as she approached him with a coy smile. "Dance with me," she said, extending her hand. Adrien hesitated, his pulse quickening at the intensity of her gaze. "There's no music," he replied. Elise tilted her head, her smile deepening. "We don't need music. Let me lead." He took her hand, and she pulled him close, their bodies swaying in perfect rhythm to an invisible melody. Her fingers trailed along his neck, her touch sending shivers down his spine. As their movements became slower, more deliberate, her lips brushed against his ear. "You make me feel alive," she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. Her words were intoxicating, and Adrien couldn't help but claim her lips. The kiss was hungry, their bodies colliding as the tension between them reached a fever pitch. She pressed him against the cool marble pillar, her nails raking down his chest as she whispered his name like a prayer, but as their passion built, the air around them shifted. The room grew colder, and Adrien felt an oppressive weight settle over him. He pulled back, his breathing ragged, and noticed Elise's expression had changed. Her eyes were wide, her lips parted in a silent gasp. A faint, ghostly light flickered at the edge of the room. And Adrien turned to see a figure, a woman in a tattered gown, her face obscured but her presence undeniable. "Elise," Adrien said, his voice trembling. "Who was that?" Elise stepped back, her hands trembling as she clutched the fabric of her dress. "She's a reminder of what?" Adrien demanded, his voice rising. Elise's gaze locked onto his, and for the first time, he saw fear in her eyes. "Of what happens when desire turns to greed. She was my predecessor, Adrien. The one who tried to." Adrien's mind reeled. "Curse? What are you talking about?" Elise sighed, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of centuries bore down on her. "This chateau was built on promises of passion and pleasure, but at a cost. Those who dwell here must feed the curse, or become its victims. Every touch, every kiss, draws you deeper into its grasp." He stared at her, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a vice. "And me? What happens to me?" Elise stepped closer, her hands cupping his face. Her touch was tender, yet it burned with an urgency he couldn't ignore. "I didn't want this for you. I tried to resist, but the chateau, it chose you, Adrien. And now, I can't let you go." Before he could respond, she kissed him again, her desperation palpable. This time, her touch was different, more urgent, as if she were trying to drown out her own fears. Adrien's resolve faltered as he surrendered to her, their bodies moving together in a fevered frenzy. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, the air thick with an unseen force. Adrien felt himself slipping, not just into Elise's embrace but into something far darker, and as the night wore on, he realized that the line between pleasure and peril had vanished entirely. Elise wasn't just his lover, she was his captor, and he was as much a part of the chateau's curse as she was. The next morning, Adrien awoke in Elise's bed. Her form curled against him. The sunlight streaming through the window did little to dispel the darkness that lingered in his mind. He needed answers, and as he gazed down at Elise, her beauty radiant even in sleep, he vowed to uncover the truth behind the chateau's curse, before it consumed them both. Adrien lay still, his body still tangled in the sheets as he gazed at Elise's sleeping form. The warmth of her body against his was the only comfort in the unsettling silence that surrounded him. The memories of their night together lingered like a haze, intoxicating, and there was a question that burned in his mind: what had he truly given up by surrendering to her? The night felt like an eternity, a dark spiral he couldn't escape. Elise stirred in her sleep, her body shifting closer to his. Her lips parted as if to speak, but she only sighed softly, her breath warm against his skin. Adrien's heart pounded in his chest, but this time it was not from passion, it was from the unsettling fear that something was terribly wrong. He gently pushed himself out of the bed, trying not to wake her, his body still humming from the touch of her skin. As he moved across the room, the floor creaked under his weight. The room, bathed in golden morning light, seemed too quiet. The same eerie presence he had felt last night lingered in the corners, like a shadow he couldn't shake. Adrien reached for his shirt on the chair by the window and pulled it over his head, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that the chateau was more than just a backdrop for their twisted romance. It was a living entity, feeding off their desires, controlling their every move. he turned to Elise, her face peaceful as she slept. His heart ached for her, but a part of him feared her as well. She had warned him, but in the heat of their passion, he hadn't listened. The silence was broken by a soft rustling. Elise's eyes fluttered open, and her gaze locked onto Adrien with an intensity that made his pulse race. "You're leaving," she said, her voice laced with a quiet sadness. Adrien swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I need to understand what's happening here. This place, Elise, it's more than just a home. There's something dark about it." Her lips quivered, and she slowly sat up in the bed, the silk sheets pooling around her body, revealing more of her curves. She didn't speak at first, her eyes following him as if she were trying to read his thoughts. Then, with a soft sigh, she stood and walked toward Adrien, she whispered, her voice almost pleading. "I've already warned you. There's no escaping it." Before he could respond, Elise's hands were on his chest, pushing him gently back until he was pressed against the wall. The cold stone sent a shiver through him, but it was nothing compared to the heat building between them. She leaned in, her lips brushing his ear as she spoke, her voice low and seductive. "You think you can leave?" "Think again," she breathed, her hands tracing down his chest, over his stomach, until they reached the waistband of his pants. Adrien's breath caught in his throat. His body, which had once been so uncertain, now responded to her touch with undeniable need. He gripped her wrists, intending to push her away, but the intensity in her eyes, that dark, consuming gaze, stopped him. He couldn't fight it anymore. With a soft moan, Elise kissed him, her lips pressing firmly against his, claiming him once more. Her body moved with fluid grace as she kissed him harder, more passionately, as though she were starving for him. His hands roamed her back, pulling her closer, feeling the soft warmth of her skin beneath the delicate fabric of her gown. She was more than just a woman, she was the embodiment of everything he desired, and everything he feared. "Elise, I don't know if I can." His words were lost in another searing kiss, one that left him breathless and wanting more. "You will," she whispered, her lips trailing down his jawline and over his neck. "You've already chosen, Adrien. Now there's no turning back." Her hands were everywhere, caressing, teasing, and driving him to the edge of madness. She slowly lowered herself to her knees, her eyes never leaving his as she unbuttoned his pants with a practiced slowness. Adrien's heart pounded in his chest as his body betrayed him, his desire overpowering any resistance he had left. When she finally took him in her mouth, it was as though the world outside ceased. The thing that mattered was the heat of her mouth, the way she moved with such purpose, as though she were trying to draw his very soul from him. Each touch sent waves of pleasure crashing through him, until he was lost in the depths of desire. But even as their bodies danced together in perfect harmony, Adrien couldn't shake the feeling that something was slowly unraveling inside him. Elise's touch was more than just pleasure, it was consuming him. As she pulled him closer, kissing him fiercely, he realized that the line between love, lust, and the curse that bound them both had long since vanished. He was no longer just a man. He was part of something much darker, a ritual that demanded more than just his body, it demanded his soul. And Elise, with her sweet promises and seductive touch, was both his salvation and his damnation. Adrien's breath was heavy as Elise's lips left his, her hands still gripping his chest. The intensity of their connection sent electric sparks through him, each touch stoking the fire that had been building since the moment they met. But as the weight of her gaze bore into him, Adrien realized that their passion was more than just desire, it was something darker, something ancient. Elise stood before him, her fingers tracing the edge of his jawline, her expression one of both longing and restraint. Her eyes shimmered with a dangerous glint, the same glimmer that had haunted his dreams since arriving at the chateau. "I want you, Adrien," she whispered, her voice low and husky. "But not just in the way you think." Adrien's heart raced. He was caught between the man he was and the man he was becoming under her influence. There was no denying the allure of her, the magnetic pull that seemed to drown out every rational thought in his mind. "I don't understand," he murmured, his voice shaking slightly as he reached out to touch her, his hand brushing against her silken skin. Elise's eyes darkened, her lips curling into a seductive smile. "You will. But first, you need to understand the price of what you seek." Before he could respond, Elise's hand slipped down to the back of his neck, pulling him in for another kiss. It was deep, intense, as if she were marking him as her own, binding him further to the curse that had already taken root within him. The heat between them built rapidly, every kiss, every touch taking them closer to the edge. As she broke away from him, Elise's voice became a low, breathy whisper. Come with me. It's time to show you what you've chosen. She led him down the darkened hallway, her presence like a siren's call, drawing him deeper into the chateau's labyrinthine corridors. The air grew heavier, charged with an unsettling energy. Adrien could feel his pulse quicken, his body yearning for her even as his mind screamed for answers. They stopped before an ancient wooden door, the surface scarred with age and wear. Elise turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "This is where it all begins," she said softly, her eyes flicking toward the door. "Behind this door is where the curse lives. And behind it is where you'll truly understand your place in this twisted tale." Adrien swallowed hard, his mind racing. What is this curse? What does it want from me? Elise placed a finger against his lips, silencing him. "You'll know soon enough. But be warned. Adrien, there's no going back after you step inside." With a trembling hand, she turned the handle, and the door creaked open. Inside, the room was dark, save for the flickering light of candles casting long shadows along the walls. The air was thick with the scent of earth and incense, a smell that seemed to permeate his very soul. The room itself was a shrine of sorts, filled with strange symbols carved into the stone floor, some of which seemed to pulse with an otherworldly glow. In the center of the room, surface covered with a thick red cloth, Elise stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the altar. "This is where it all began, where my curse was sealed. And now, you are a part of it." Adrien felt his chest tighten, his breath shallow as his gaze fell to the altar. He could see the faint outline of something dark and grotesque etched into the surface. "You've been drawn here for a reason, Adrien," Elise continued, her voice now low and almost reverent. "Your desire, your passion, it feeds this place. And in return, it promises you everything you've ever wanted." He couldn't look away from the altar, his heart hammering in his chest. "What do you mean?" Before Elise could answer, the room seemed to shift, the temperature dropping suddenly. A low growl echoed from the shadows, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Adrien's blood ran cold, and he instinctively took a step back, his eyes wide with fear. "What is that?" he whispered, panic rising in his chest. Elise's smile faded, replaced with a look of resignation. "The price. The curse demands its payment." A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, cloaked in darkness, its face hidden beneath a hood. As it moved into the candlelight, Adrien gasped in horror. It was neither man nor beast, but something far worse, a twisted creature, its skin slick and black, with jagged limbs that scraped the floor as it walked toward them. "This is what awaits you, Adrien," Elise said, her voice trembling. "A choice. You can leave now, escape, and sever the bond between us. Or, you can stay, and the curse will claim you as it has claimed me." Adrien's body trembled, but his gaze remained locked on Elise. He knew that leaving would mean abandoning her, but staying meant plunging deeper. "Choose me," she whispered, her voice dripping with need. In that moment, Adrien understood that his fate had already been sealed. The passion that had drawn him to her was both his salvation and his doom. And as he stepped closer to the altar, the creature's growl echoed in the room, a chilling reminder that once he crossed the threshold, there would be no turning back. The room trembled as Adrien stepped toward Elise, the monstrous creature looming over the altar, its jagged breaths echoing through the air. Despite the terror gnawing at the edges of his mind, he couldn't deny the pull toward her. Every fiber of his being burned with desire, even as his instincts screamed to flee. Elise turned, her silhouette illuminated by the eerie glow of the cursed symbols etched into the floor. Her beauty was intoxicating, and her smile was both inviting and foreboding. "You've chosen me, Adrien," she purred, her voice like velvet. "But now, you must prove your devotion." Adrien reached out to her, his fingers grazing her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a brief moment before she pulled him close. Their lips met in a fiery kiss, her body pressing against his as the world around them faded into the haze of their passion. But even in the heat of the moment, Adrien couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. A sudden, blood-curdling scream tore through the room, snapping Adrien out of his trance. He spun around, his heart pounding as the shadows seemed to writhe and shift. The creature that had been looming by the altar was gone. What was that? He demanded, his voice trembling. Elise's expression darkened. "The curse is restless," she said, her voice low. "It feeds on more than just passion, it craves fear, blood, and pain. Before Adrien could respond, the door to the room slammed shut, the sound reverberating like a death knell. The flickering candlelight cast grotesque shadows on the plummeted, the sound of dragging footsteps echoed through the corridor outside. Adrien's pulse quickened, his breath coming in shallow gasps as the door creaked open slowly. Standing in the doorway was a man, or what was left of one. His face was a grotesque mask of horror, his flesh torn and bloodied, his eyes wide with terror. "Run," the man croaked before collapsing to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Adrien stumbled backward, his stomach churning. What the hell is going on? Elise stepped forward, her expression unreadable. The Chateau has claimed another victim, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. This is its true nature, Adrien. It seduces. It lures, and then it destroys. Adrien's head spun. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you bring me here? Elise's eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place, regret, perhaps, or sorrow. Because I'm bound to it. And now, so are you. Suddenly, the creature from before emerged from the shadows, its jagged limbs dripping with fresh blood. It let out a guttural growl, its glowing eyes fixed on Adrien. Before he could react, it lunged at him, claws slicing through the air. Adrien dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the attack. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. The creature was faster than it looked, its movements erratic and terrifying. Adrien grabbed a candlestick from a nearby table. Holding it like a weapon as the beast advanced, Elise watched from the sidelines, her expression a mix of desire and despair. Fight, Adrien. Prove your worth. The creature lunged again, its claws narrowly missing Adrien's chest. He swung the candlestick with all his might, striking the beast across the face. It howled in pain, its flesh smoking where the metal had made contact. Adrien didn't have time to celebrate his small victory. The beast recovered quickly, its glowing eyes burning with rage. It swiped at him again, and this time, its claws found into his shoulder. Adrien cried out in pain, blood staining his shirt as he staggered backward. Elise, help me! He shouted, desperation in his voice. Elise hesitated, her hands trembling. I can't, she whispered. If I interfere, the curse will punish us both. Adrien glared at her, anger and betrayal bubbling to the surface. Then why bring me here? What do you want from me? Elise stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. I want you to survive, she said softly. Because if you do, we can break the curse together. The creature roared, interrupting their conversation. Adrien turned just in time to see it charging toward him. He braced himself, clutching the candlestick tightly. As the beast leapt, Adrien ducked and drove the makeshift weapon into its chest. The creature let out a deafening screech, its body convulsing before it collapsed to the ground. Adrien stood over the beast, his chest heaving. Blood dripped from his shoulder, and his hands trembled. He turned to Elise, his eyes blazing with anger. What now? Elise approached him slowly, her gaze softening. Now, we prepare for the next trial. The curse won't stop until it's satisfied. Adrien shook his head. And what happens if I fail? Elise placed a hand on his cheek, her touch sending shivers down his spine. Then it will claim you, body and soul. And I'll lose you forever. Adrien stared at her, his mind racing. Despite everything, he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her, the way she made him feel alive even in the face of death. He knew he was in too deep, but there was no turning back now. Then let's end this, he said, his voice steady. Together. Elise smiled, her eyes glinting with hope and something darker. Together, she agreed, her lips brushing against his in a kiss that was both a promise and a curse, but deep down, Adrien knew that their battle had only just begun. And the Chateau wasn't done. The Chateau grew heavier as Adrien and Elise prepared for what lay ahead. The flickering candlelight danced on the blood-streaked walls, and Adrien felt the weight of the cursed mansion pressing down on him. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant whisper, filled him with dread. He tightened his grip on the jagged candlestick he had used to wound the beast, the sharp metal sticky with dark blood. Elise led him down the winding hallways of the Chateau, her steps deliberate, her breathing shallow. Adrien couldn't help but notice her tension, the way her shoulders stiffened at every sound. The sensual allure that had entranced him before was now replaced with something colder, calculated. almost detached. Where are we going? Adrien asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. To the heart of the curse, Elise replied, her voice low and unwavering. The chateau has a master, and it's time you met him. As they descended into the catacombs beneath the mansion, the air grew colder, the walls narrowing with each step. Adrien's stomach churned at the smell, rotting flesh, damp stone, and something metallic, like blood. The flickering light from Elise's lantern illuminated grotesque carvings on the walls, scenes of torture, sacrifice, and dark rituals. What is this place? Adrien asked, his voice trembling. This is where the curse was born, Elise said, her tone devoid of emotion. Generations ago, the lord of this chateau made a pact with something beyond comprehension. Power and immortality in exchange for eternal suffering. Now, the chateau feeds on blood and fear. Adrien felt his pulse quicken. And you? Are you part of this? Elise stopped and turned to him, her eyes glistening with something he couldn't identify, guilt, perhaps, or regret. I was born into it. Bound to the curse. But I've fought it, Adrien. And I believe you can break it. Before Adrien could respond, a scream echoed through the catacombs, a scream so raw, so visceral. Down his spine. He froze, gripping the candlestick tighter. They've found another, Elise murmured, her expression grim. Another what? Adrien demanded. Elise's gaze was distant. Another victim. The scream grew louder as they approached a large iron door. Elise hesitated before pushing it open, revealing a gruesome tableau. A man was strapped to a stone slab in the center of the room, his body riddled with fresh wounds. Blood pooled beneath him, and his screams filled the chamber as shadowy figures moved around him, their faces obscured by grotesque masks. Adrien's stomach lurched. What the hell is this? The chateau's ritual, Elise said, her voice hollow. It needs blood to sustain itself. Fear to feed its master. One of the masked figures turned toward them, its movements jerky and inhuman. Adrien's breath caught as he realized the figure's eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. Elise grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. We need to move. Now. But before they could retreat, the figure let out an otherworldly screech, alerting the others. The masked figures turned in unison, their glowing eyes locking onto Adrien and Elise. Run! Elise shouted, pulling him toward a side passage. They sprinted through the labyrinthine catacombs, the sound of heavy footsteps and guttural growls echoing behind them. Adrien's mind raced, his body running on pure adrenaline. The passage twisted and turned, and he struggled to keep up with Elise as she navigated the maze. Finally, they burst into another chamber, a vast, circular room with a raised altar in the center. Chains hung from the ceiling, and the floor was slick with fresh blood. At the far end of the room stood a figure cloaked in darkness, its presence radiating malice. The master, Elise whispered, her voice trembling. Adrien took a step back, his grip on the candlestick tightening. How do we stop this? Elise turned to him, her eyes desperate. You have to do the only way to break the curse. Before Adrien could respond, the figure stepped forward, revealing a monstrous visage. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its skeletal frame, its eyes like black voids. It raised a clawed hand, and the chains hanging from the ceiling sprang to life, lashing out toward them. Adrien ducked, narrowly avoiding the chains as they whipped past him. Elise wasn't as lucky. One of the chains wrapped around her ankle, dragging her toward the altar. She screamed, clawing at the ground. Adrien, help me! She cried. Adrien hesitated for a moment before rushing toward her. He swung the candlestick at the chain, the metal sparking as it struck. The chain loosened, and Elise scrambled to her feet, but the master was already advancing, its movements slow but deliberate. Adrien knew they couldn't outrun it. He glanced at Elise, his mind racing. What do we do? He demanded. Elise's gaze flicked to the altar. The ritual. If we disrupt it, it might weaken him. Adrien nodded, determination hardening his features. Together, they sprinted toward the altar, dodging the writhing chains. The master let out a guttural roar, its movements becoming more frenzied. Reaching the altar, Adrien grabbed one of the ceremonial daggers lying on its surface. He turned to Elise. What now? Destroy the symbols, she said, gesturing to the carvings on the altar. They're the source of his power. Adrien didn't hesitate. He plunged the dagger into the stone, chipping away at the carvings. The room shook violently, and the master let out an ear-piercing scream. The chains thrashed wildly, and the masked figures collapsed. With one last scream, the creature vanished, leaving behind only silence. Adrien turned to Elise, his chest heaving. "Is it over?" Elise smiled weakly, her body fading. "For you, yes. But for me, my time is up." Before Adrien could respond, she disappeared, leaving him alone in the blood-soaked chamber. Adrien stood frozen in the blood-soaked chamber, Elise's final words echoing in his mind. The oppressive silence that followed was deafening. The air in the catacombs seemed heavier now, as though the darkness itself was alive and waiting, but his reprieve was short-lived. A chilling metallic creak reverberated through the chamber. Adrien turned sharply, heart pounding, to see the chains that had fallen limp moments ago beginning to rise again, coiling like snakes. The master's presence may have vanished, but the chateau still demanded its due. The walls seemed to whisper, and the faint echoes of screams filled the cavernous space, growing louder with each passing second. The rise of the new master. Adrien stumbled backward, his trembling fingers gripping the bloodied ceremonial dagger. The carvings he'd destroyed on the altar began to reassemble themselves, the stone knitting back together like a festering wound. Panic surged through him as he realized that the ritual wasn't just about summoning the master, it was about succession. The chateau had chosen its next victim. Or worse, its new lord. "No," Adrien whispered, shaking his head as the realization dawned. "It can't be me." The shadows around the room darkened, condensing into humanoid forms. Their glowing eyes pierced the dim light as they advanced toward Adrien, their movements slow but deliberate, like predators savoring their prey. Each step echoed with malice, and Adrien could feel their hunger, a gnawing desire for blood and fear. He ran, his feet pounded against the cold stone floors as he sprinted through the labyrinthine tunnels. His breath-ragged whispers followed him, growing louder, more insistent. The shadows didn't chase him in haste, they stalked him, their presence an ever-looming threat. As he rounded a corner, Adrien skidded to a halt. The passage ahead was blocked, rows of chains stretched across it, their sharp edges glinting in the faint torchlight. Turning back, he found the shadows closing in, their clawed hands outstretched. Trapped, the figures seized Adrien, their cold, spectral hands holding him in place as he thrashed and screamed. They dragged him back to the altar chamber, their strength unyielding. The air grew colder, and Adrien's breath came out in visible puffs. Back at the altar, the stone slab glistened, its surface slick with fresh blood. Adrien fought harder, but the figures threw him onto the slab with ease, pinning his arms and legs with iron clamps. The chains descended from the ceiling like serpents, coiling around his wrists and ankles, biting into his skin. Pain shot through his body, and his screams echoed through the chamber. A low growl rumbled from the darkness, and Adrien's blood ran cold. The master hadn't vanished, it had merely transformed. The figure that stepped forward was no longer skeletal but monstrous, its body rippling with grotesque muscles and its face a grotesque amalgamation of eyes and fangs. It stood over Adrien, its claws dripping with viscous black liquid. Elise had been right, the only way to escape the curse was through destruction. But she hadn't told him the cost. The master raised a jagged blade and plunged it into Adrien's chest. Pain exploded through his body, blinding him as the creature began carving runes into his flesh. Blood pooled beneath him, and Adrien's screams mingled with the echoing whispers. Through the agony, Adrien realized what the runes meant: succession. The chateau wasn't letting him die, it was preparing him to take the master's. His voice whispered in his mind, soft yet haunting, "You have to destroy the heart of the chateau." Adrien's vision blurred as he looked at the altar. A faint red glow pulsed beneath it, and he understood. With his last reserves of strength, he reached for the dagger still clutched in his hand. The master noticed too late. Adrien drove the blade into the altar with all his might, shattering the stone. The chamber erupted in chaos. The ground trembled violently, and the walls began to crack. The shadows shrieked as they dissolved into ash, and the master let out an unearthly roar as its body crumbled, its blackened flesh disintegrating. Adrien screamed as the chains tightened, pulling him toward the altar. The chateau wouldn't go down without taking its final victim. The chateau collapsed into itself, its ancient stones swallowed by the earth. A violent explosion of energy ripped through the French countryside, leaving behind nothing but a smoldering crater. The whispers were gone, the air silent. In the quiet aftermath, a lone figure emerged from the ruins. Bloodied and battered, Adrien staggered into the moonlight, clutching the shattered remnants of the ceremonial dagger. His eyes burned with an unnatural light, and the faint echo of a whisper lingered in his mind.